Hi, Guy. Thank you for being here in this very quiet moment of your day. Perhaps the room around you has gone dark. Perhaps there's still the distant sound of traffic outside. Or perhaps you're listening to this story through headphones. As the world around you has begun to fade, tonight, I want to tell you a story that doesn't begin with war, but with time. Try to imagine a family that lived long enough to witness the map of Europe change again and again, long enough to see other dynasties rise and disappear, long enough to understand that power does not always need to be loud. For nearly 600 years, that family stood at the center of Europe, not always loved, not always understood, but almost always there. They did not rule through endless conquests. They ruled through marriage, law, ritual, and through a very ancient belief that order matters more than speed. That family carries a name that has quietly passed through centuries of history: Habsburg. In this story, you don't need to remember dates. All you need to do is listen to how a family learned to survive on a continent that was never still. Before we begin, I want to ask you something very gentle. If you're listening to this story right now, leave a comment below telling us where you are in the world and what time it is where you are. And now, let history slow down and let the story begin. Not every story of power begins in the light. Many begin in darkness, not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of anonymity, a place history has not yet noticed, a name that carries no weight, a family whose voice is not yet strong enough to be written into thick chronicles. The House of Habsburg began this way. If tonight you are listening as the room has grown quiet, as the thoughts of the day have slowed, try to imagine Europe about 1,000 years ago, not as a familiar continent on a modern map, but as a half-woven tapestry where the threads were still loose and constantly shifting. At that time, Europe was not divided by straight borders. There were no border fences, no passports, no concept of the nation as we understand it today. Instead, there were overlapping lands where power did not rest in fixed places but drifted through relationships. A river could be both a boundary and a road. A forest might belong to a lord in name, yet be controlled by a monastery in practice. Power was not measured by how much land one held, but by who swore loyalty to whom. An oath could be stronger than an army. A marriage could change the fate of an entire region. And a broken oath could unleash decades of quiet violence. Europe at that time was a slow world. News traveled by foot and by horse. Great decisions were not made in short meetings, but across many seasons, many prayers, many negotiations stretched to exhaustion. People lived close to the land, close to the weather, close to uncertainty. Winter was not just a season, it was a trial. Those who survived the winter earned the right to think about the future. In that world, family was not merely a place of birth and upbringing. Family was the smallest political unit, the keeper of memory, the vessel through which land, honor, and even unpaid debts were passed down. A family that survived across generations did so not because it always won, but because it knew when to retreat, when to remain silent, and when to wait. The castles scattered across Europe were not symbols of luxury. They were heavy masses of stone raised against time, cold, and human fragility. Inside those walls, life moved slowly, faint candlelight, prayers read again and again, and small decisions, seemingly insignificant, quietly accumulating into the fate of an entire lineage. This was the Europe the House of Habsburg entered. Not a radiant stage, but a dim space where only those patient enough would be remembered by history in such a world. Mere survival was already an achievement. To survive long enough to be seen, even rarer. Hold that image gently in your mind. A Europe not yet defined. A continent learning how to become itself. And somewhere within it, very modestly, a small family taking its first steps, unhurried, unannounced, yet persistent. At that time, the name Habsburg meant nothing special. It did not evoke power. It did not suggest empire. It did not even promise anything. It was simply a name tied to a small piece of land by the Aar River, in what we now call Switzerland. There, on a modest hill, a stone castle was built, rough, heavy, and shielded from the wind. It was not built to impress. It was built to endure. Habsburg Castle, seen through modern eyes. The place appears unremarkable, not large, not grand. No symmetrical facades or halls that force one to look up in awe. Just a heavy block of stone on a hill, isolated, silent, seemingly uninterested in making an impression on anyone. To us today, it may resemble a humble ruin, a small dot on a tourist map. But in the medieval world, such a castle was never small. In an age without police, without standing armies, without any concept of public security, each castle was a fortress unto itself. Thick walls were not built for decoration, but for endurance against cold winds, against time, and against the absence of mercy when conflict arrived. A gate closed at the right moment could decide the survival of an entire family, even an entire community living in its shadow. The castle was a refuge, not only for those with titles, but for peasants, craftsmen, and livestock whenever danger approached. When the bell rang, people knew there was somewhere they could run, not to win, but to survive the night. Yet the meaning of a castle went beyond defense. It marked ownership in a world where documents were easily lost and words easily forgotten. The castle spoke for its lord. This land has someone responsible for it. From within those walls, taxes were collected, laws enforced, disputes settled. No lengthy documents were needed, only the enduring presence of stone and people. Most importantly, a castle was a fixed point in a constantly moving world. Seasons changed, populations shifted, alliances formed and collapsed, but the castle remained, winter after winter, reminding all that some things did not change as quickly as human fate. For a family like the Habsburgs, the castle was more than a residence. It was the physical memory of the lineage, a place where generations shared the same space, listened to old stories by the fire, and learned that power does not begin with display, but with the ability to hold one's ground amid the uncertainty of time. And it is from such silent blocks of stone that the longest stories in history often begin, not with echoes, but with stillness. Those who lived there did not know they stood at the beginning of a 6th century story. They only knew that to survive, they had to remain bound to the land, to surrounding relationships, and to a larger order beyond themselves. The medieval world did not operate on abstract ideas like state or nation. It functioned through loyalty. Who swore to whom? Who protected whom? Who had the right to grant land? And who was obliged to draw the sword when called? The early generations of the Habsburg family understood this well. They were not rebels. They did not seek to break the order. On the contrary, they survived by clinging closely to it. They served greater powers. They kept their promises. They appeared when needed and withdrew when they were not. This was not weakness. It was a very quiet form of intelligence. In a world where many noble families chose to display power through war and violence, the Habsburgs quietly turned onto a different path, slower, quieter, and harder to notice for those who view history only through great battles. War, in the Middle Ages, was the fastest way to be seen. One victory could bring land, titles, and fame within a single season, but it also consumed everything: people, wealth, and stability. Many families burned brightly in this way, only to fade just as quickly, leaving behind abandoned castles and names preserved only in tattered chronicles. The Habsburgs watched all of this carefully, and they learned an unwritten lesson. In a fragile world, the most valuable asset is not strength, but reliability. Instead of constantly wielding the sword, they invested in relationships with neighboring lords, with monasteries that held knowledge and spiritual influence, with higher authorities within the feudal order. Each relationship was built slowly, through promises kept, steady presence, and appearing at the right moment when the system needed someone to play their role. They did not try to stand above the system. They chose to stand within it, in the feudal order. Power did not flow in straight lines from top to bottom. It was a complex network of obligations and patronage. Those who could connect the points within that network held real power. The Habsburgs became such links, not the most prominent ones, but those whose removal would make the entire structure less stable. Trust, once established, creates cumulative effects. When a mediator was needed to settle disputes, the Habsburgs were named. When a family loyal enough to bear responsibility was required, the Habsburgs appeared each time. Their position within the system was reinforced, never enough to alarm, but strong enough to be indispensable. This path did not bring immediate glory. It demanded patience, the ability to remain in shadow while others stepped into the light. But over time, that patience transformed the Habsburgs from a local family into an essential part of the operating order. And when that order needed a familiar, stable, non-disruptive name to elevate to higher responsibility, the Habsburgs had already been there, long enough that choosing them felt natural. No one feared them, but no one dismissed them either. And sometimes, in history, that is the safest position of all. The earliest generations of Habsburgs left little trace in history books. No great victories, no heroic epics. What they left behind was continuity. Their name appeared regularly in documents, in contracts, in oaths. It was not written in red ink, but it did not disappear, while many families flared up and vanished. The Habsburgs remained like a small lamp in the long medieval night, not bright enough to draw attention, but steady enough not to be extinguished. And within that steadiness, something crucial began to form, a sense of time. The Habsburgs did not act as people thinking only of a single lifetime. They acted as if working for generations, yet unborn. Land was preserved, relationships were strengthened. Marriages were considered not only for emotion, but for position within a wider network of power. No one called it a strategy, but it was already a strategy. When you hear of great dynasties in history, you usually hear about moments of explosion, a battle, a conquest, a king appearing like thunder. For the Habsburgs, the decisive moment did not arrive that way. It came very slowly. It came from always being present when order needed a keeper, from never threatening others, yet never being easy to remove, from becoming, over time, a familiar name to those who held the power to decide. And then, as Europe entered centuries of upheaval, as the throne of the Holy Roman Empire ceased to be self-evident, as the electors began searching for a name that was safe, loyal, and non-disruptive, that name was already there. Not because it was brilliant, but because it was familiar. The House of Habsburg did not step onto the historical stage in a sudden moment. They did not seize power overnight, nor astonish Europe with a single act. Instead, they were brought into the light very gently, almost unconsciously, by the very order they had patiently served for generations, for a long time. The Habsburgs were always in the right place when needed, never prominent enough to provoke suspicion, never weak enough to be discarded. They became such a familiar part of the feudal system that their presence felt inevitable. So when the time came, when the old order needed a stable name to entrust with greater power, history did not treat it as a shock. There was no surprise, no sudden reversal. Everything unfolded as if it had been arranged long ago. The next logical step in a slow, continuous, almost unavoidable process. But that is the story of the next chapter. In this chapter, what matters is not what the Habsburgs became, but what they did not become for a very long time. They did not rush. They did not skip steps. They did not seek the center. They chose to stand firm. And sometimes, in human history, standing firm long enough is the very first step toward power. If your eyelids feel a little heavier now, that is no accident. History at this stage is not loud. It flows like a slow river, carrying names not yet spoken aloud. At the beginning, Habsburg was just one of them. But tonight, you have heard that name. And from this moment on, it will not disappear again. If you are still listening tonight, try to imagine Europe in the late 13th century, a weary continent, not weary from endless war, but weary from the absence of order. Thrones still existed, yet no longer felt secure. Titles were still proclaimed, yet no longer carried enough weight to inspire trust. The Holy Roman Empire, in name, still stood there like an ancient stone pillar holding up the entire order of medieval Europe. It still bore a majestic title. It still had ceremonies, seals, and documents written in solemn Latin. In the imagination of the people of that age, the empire was still the continuation of ancient Rome, a symbol of order, law, and a sacred will permitted by God. But if you looked more closely, behind that outward form was a structure slowly hollowing out from within. After the death of Emperor Frederick II in the middle of the 13th century, the empire drifted into a prolonged suspension. There was no successor strong enough to be acknowledged by all the competing powers. There was no true center of authority capable of coordinating the vast lands stretching from Italy and Germany into Central Europe. This period, which history calls the Interregnum, was not a complete collapse, but a kind of silence of power. In that silence, the empire still existed on paper, but it no longer spoke with a single voice. Princes, dukes, bishops, and free cities began to act as nearly independent units. Laws were still invoked in the emperor's name, but there was no one with sufficient legitimacy to enforce them consistently. Order did not disappear. It thinned to ordinary people. The Holy Roman Empire now resembled a great roof with no caretaker. That roof still sheltered them in name, but each room inside was left to fend for itself. Each land followed its own rules. Each lord governed in his own way, and when disputes arose, no one was certain whom to turn to for judgment. The most frightening thing about this era was not constant war, but uncertainty. No one knew the true limits of power. No one knew how far an oath would be protected. And in a feudal world, where everything rested on promises and honor, that uncertainty gnawed at trust slowly, but deeply. And precisely in this context, the role of the emperor, though weakened, became more necessary than ever, not to conquer, but to serve as a spiritual and legal anchor. An emperor widely recognized might not control every territory, but his existence prevented feudal relationships from sliding entirely into chaos. So the Great Interregnum was not merely the lack of a king, it was the feeling that an order once trusted was losing its shape. And when a society senses its order dissolving, it does not search for a hero, it searches for stability from that deeply human need. The question of who would wear the crown was no longer a matter of personal ambition. It became a matter of survival for an entire system. And that was the moment when history began to lean toward names that were familiar, cautious, and least disruptive, names that had learned, for a very long time, how to endure in silence. In that vacuum, power did not vanish. It fragmented. It flowed into local lords, self-governing cities, ecclesiastical authorities, and families swift enough to seize their share. But fragmentation did not bring stability. It created anxiety. And when people feel anxious, they begin searching for something very specific. A safe name. Not the greatest name, not the most frightening name, but the name that carried the least risk. In that climate, the empire's electors entered a period where every decision came with danger. They were not observers standing outside history. They were trapped inside it. Each elector had his own territory, his own army, his own ambitions, and his own private fear that any chosen emperor could become a direct threat to his autonomy. Choosing an emperor, therefore, was not like seeking a great leader. It was more like trying to find a fragile balance point in a room filled with breakable objects. If they chose a house that was too strong, a dynasty already possessing vast lands, armies, and influence, then the crown would become an instrument of oppression. The emperor would no longer be a coordinator, but a ruler, and that would mean the electors would slowly lose their voices, piece by piece, under the name of order. But if they chose a name too weak, a man without enough prestige or ability to wield authority, then the interregnum's emptiness would continue in another form. The imperial title would still exist, but only as a shadow. Order would not be restored. Disputes would persist, and the electors themselves, having made the choice, would bear the consequences of a decision without weight. They needed someone strong enough to be respected, but not strong enough to make everyone wary, familiar enough to feel safe, but not prominent enough to awaken fear. In long deliberations, in whispered conversations within stone halls, in discreet letters exchanged in secret, names appeared and were crossed out. Some were too sharp, others too faint, and then, very slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, one name began to be mentioned more often, not with excitement, not with praise, but with a simple sentence. Perhaps this man will not cause trouble. Habsburg. That name carried a sense of familiarity. It did not summon memories of bloody conquests. It did not suggest fear of an empire swelling too large. It evoked the image of a family that had been there for a long time, long enough to be trusted, yet never so overpowering as to be considered a threat. Habsburg did not promise an age of immediate glory, but it promised what Europe desired most at that moment: stability, and in an era exhausted by uncertainty. That promise, though never spoken aloud, carried more weight than any speech, not because they had ever done anything shocking, but because they had never done anything that made others afraid. The head of the family at that time was Rudolf I of Habsburg, a name that, from the distance of many centuries, can easily be skimmed over. He left behind no immortal quotations. He is not tied to a heroic legend endlessly retold in textbooks. He often appears as a transitional figure, a face standing between brighter names. But to those who were actually operating the feudal world in the late 13th century, Rudolf was a very familiar presence. He was familiar because he had been there for a long time, in councils, in the settlement of disputes, in the tangled relationships among lords, church authorities, and royalty. Rudolf was not the maker of laws, but he understood how laws were used. He did not stand outside the system to criticize it. He stood within it, close enough to know which boundaries must not be crossed. Rudolf was not a legendary warrior in the romantic sense. He did not chase glory through reckless expeditions, but he was not weak either. When necessary, he could draw the sword. He simply did not treat war as the only language of power. For Rudolf, war was the last resort, not the starting point. What made Rudolf trusted was not personal strength, but the way he handled power. He knew how to listen, how to yield at the right moment, how to sense when to step forward and when to stop, so as not to disrupt the fragile balance among greater and lesser forces. In a world where many failed because they did not understand their limits, Rudolf built his authority precisely by not crossing those limits. He understood that, in the feudal order, a man too prominent quickly became a target. A man too ambitious made allies turn away. So Rudolf chose to exist as a man who was enough, strong enough to be respected, soft enough not to be isolated, patient enough to wait for the right moment. To later generations, that lack of brilliance can make him seem pale. But to the electors and lords of his time, it was a sign of reliability. Rudolf did not make them worry that tomorrow the order would be overturned. He did not promise a glorious future that would be impossible to control. He promised, through the very manner of his life and conduct, that things would not become worse, and in a period when Europe was already exhausted by ceaseless upheaval, that silent promise, though never publicly proclaimed, became Rudolf I of Habsburg's greatest strength. Rudolf knew he could not rule by aura, and he did not need to. When he was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1273, the event did not send shockwaves across Europe. There were no frenzied celebrations throughout the continent. There was no sense that history had suddenly veered. On the contrary, many people exhaled. At last, the void had been filled. But do not mistake that quiet for insignificance. In history, the most important decisions are often made in the calmest air, because when a decision provokes no controversy, it has a greater chance of lasting. Rudolf ascended the throne not as a conqueror, but as a steward invited in to restore order. And the first thing he faced was not ceremony, but reality, the emperor's power. At this point, existed only if he could turn a title into real order. One of the greatest challenges came from Bohemia, where King Ottokar II controlled a vast and wealthy domain. Ottokar refused to accept that a house like the Habsburgs, comparatively modest, had been granted the crown. The conflict between them was not merely a single battle, but a collision of two understandings of power. One side believed power came from strength and territory. The other believed power came from legitimacy. When Rudolf defeated Ottokar, that victory did not carry only military meaning. It was a clear declaration. The throne was not a prize for the strongest man, but for the man most widely acknowledged. And from that victory, the Habsburgs gained, for the first time, lands that would shape their future, especially Austria and Styria. But what is striking is not that they gained land. It is how they kept it. Rudolf did not turn victory into a wave of purges. He did not seek endless expansion. He consolidated. He legitimized. He made new territories stable parts of the order, not temporary spoils. For Rudolf, the throne was not an endpoint. It was a tool to place the Habsburgs where they had never stood before, at the center of the system. For the first time, the name Habsburg was not tied only to a castle or a small region. It was tied to an institution. And when a family binds its name to an institution, it does not need to appear everywhere. As long as the system functions, that name will continue to be spoken. Yet Rudolf also understood something crucial. The Holy Roman crown was not a simple hereditary possession. It had to be sustained through continuous consent. So he did not try to turn the crown into his family's absolute property. Instead, he did something wiser. He made the Habsburgs the reasonable candidate for both the present and the future. He strengthened the family's position in strategic lands. He laid foundations for inheriting influence, not merely a title. And most importantly, he did not break the empire's fragile balance with excessive ambition. When Rudolf died, the Habsburgs did not immediately become the undisputed ruling house, but they had achieved something they had never had before: legitimacy on a European scale. From that moment on, whenever the electors needed a name to place on the throne, the Habsburgs were always on the list, not always chosen, but never eliminated. And that was the decisive difference. The turning point of 1273 did not make the Habsburgs an empire overnight. It made them part of the larger question: who has the right to rule Europe? Once a family becomes part of that question, it has stepped out of the dark, not with a leap, but with a single, steady step. If you are listening with your eyes already closed, let this moment settle. A man wearing a crown in silence, a family entering the light without glare, and an ancient system, for the first time in many years, finding its breath again. But as history always reminds us, a crown is never an ending. It is only an invitation to step deeper into responsibility. And for the Habsburgs, that road had only just begun. There is a saying that has been passed down through European courts. No one knows who first spoke it, but it remained for a very long time, long enough to become a kind of silent truth of power. Let others wage war, happy Austria, marry. In Habsburg history, it is the red thread that ties centuries together. After the turning point of 1273, the Habsburgs stepped into the light. But they did not choose to move forward through endless conquests. They had seen too many other houses rise quickly and collapse just as quickly. They understood that war could expand territory, but it also opened cracks in the people's hearts, in finances, and within the ruling family itself. So the Habsburgs chose another path, a path that, at a glance, could be mistaken for a lack of ambition. That path did not pass through battlefields of mud and blood, but through cold stone halls, where footsteps echoed slowly and words were weighed more carefully than swords. Their power was not drawn on maps with red arrows showing marching directions. It was recorded in thick genealogies, where names followed one another across generations. That path was not loud. There were no triumphal songs, no moments that made all of Europe stop and stare. But it was persistent. And it was precisely that persistence that made it dangerous to those who measured power only by speed. In the medieval world, marriage was never a private matter between two people. It did not begin with emotion, nor end with personal happiness. Marriage was a living document, a treaty signed not only with ink, but with blood and lineage. It was a bridge across distances that armies would need years, even decades, to cross, if they could cross them at all. A wedding could bind two distant courts. A child born from it could become the key that unlocked an entire land. And an oath before the altar could do what thousands of soldiers could not: turn a stranger into kin. The Habsburgs understood this very early, perhaps because they had watched too many families around them choose the opposite path, striking fast, seizing hard, and then exhausting themselves under the weight of the lands they had just taken. The Habsburgs realized that violence could force obedience, but only blood ties could make that obedience endure. They did not marry for love, at least not in the way we understand it today. They married to connect lands through bonds that were difficult to cut, to connect dynasties through family duty rather than fear, to connect the present to the future, through children who would inherit not only a name, but also rights accumulated before they were even born. Every Habsburg marriage was a decision calculated with great care. Who married whom, at what time, under what conditions? All of it was weighed like pieces of a larger picture, not a picture of one lifetime, but of many generations. And it was precisely there that the deepest nature of the Habsburg strategy revealed itself. They did not seek to win quickly. They sought to remain within the network of power, within the memory of other courts, to remain long enough that when the world changed, the name Habsburg would still appear among the legitimate choices. In European history, many houses left their mark through the thunder of war. The Habsburgs left theirs through the long silence of connections, and by the time people recognized it, the network had become too tight to undo without shaking the entire continent. For the Habsburgs, every marriage was never an emotional or accidental decision. It was considered as a move placed on Europe's chessboard, slow, calculated, always aimed toward long-term balance rather than immediate victory. It was not a move to deliver checkmate at once, to bring an opponent down in a brief instant. On the contrary, it was a move meant to keep the board from collapsing, so the game of power could continue without sliding into chaos. In the medieval world, where territorial disputes often stretched across generations, war rarely solved problems at their roots. A victory today could create a feud for tomorrow, but a well-timed marriage could do what blades could not. It could place a social and legal full stop on conflicts that seemed never-ending. When two houses became in-laws, continued hostility was not only costly, it became difficult to justify before the law, before the church, and before their own communities. A skillful marriage also had the power to turn an enemy into family. The one who once stood on the opposite side of the line suddenly became someone with shared interests, shared blood, a shared future. A land that had been the cause of war could now be transferred as dowry, not as plunder, but as a lawful part of a household. That transfer was gentle, yet profound, because it was bound to ritual, to inheritance law, and to the approval of the society of the time. While many noble houses treated marriage as a secondary feature of power, a way to reinforce what had already been seized by force, the Habsburgs reversed that order. For them, marriage was not decoration. It was the skeleton supporting the entire structure. War, if it came at all, served only as an accessory to an order already shaped in advance by blood ties. This approach demanded a rare, long-term vision. It required accepting that power would not bring immediate satisfaction. Those who entered these marriages were often chosen not for personality, but for the position they held in the larger picture. And it was precisely that quiet sacrifice of individuals for the benefit of the house that allowed the Habsburgs to build a network of power more durable than any military victory. over time, as these marital moves layered upon one another. Europe's chessboard became increasingly stable in a way that favored the Habsburgs, not because they ruled every square, but because they connected so many squares together, and in a game where stability determines long survival. The Habsburgs chose the right role, not the one who overturns the board, but the one who keeps it standing. They built their network slowly, through ties not easily severed, for war can end with a treaty, but blood cannot be dissolved by a signature. One of the crucial moments of that strategy arrived at the end of the 15th century, not on a battlefield, but in the silence of rooms where the greatest decisions are often made in the softest voices. There, a young Habsburg man stood before a choice that seemed personal, almost private, yet carried enough force to bend the direction of Europe for centuries to come. That man was Maximilian I. Maximilian was not born to inherit a fully formed empire. He did not enter life with a power map already laid out before him. What he inherited first was a house that had learned how to wait, a line that understood that lasting power does not come from haste, but from the ability to see beyond a single lifetime. In the stories told within the family, Maximilian grew up with the idea that quick victories might impress, but only long connections could truly reshape order. By the time Maximilian came of age, the Habsburgs stood firm in Central Europe, yet remained constrained. They had titles, prestige, legitimacy, but they lacked the decisive thing needed to move beyond that familiar space. A gateway, not a military gateway, roads that could be blocked, fortresses that could be besieged, but a political and economic gateway through which power could spread without coercion. Maximilian understood that limit clearly. He could see a Europe changing, cities of trade growing more prosperous than castles, merchants beginning to speak with a voice equal to nobles, and wealth, instead of coming only from land, beginning to flow along trade routes, to go farther than Central Europe. The Habsburgs could not rely on swords alone. They needed access to rich centers, to lands where money and influence moved freely. And there, Maximilian realized what he needed was not an expedition, but a link. The choice before him was not presented as a plan of conquest. It appeared in the form of a marriage, a decision that outwardly resembled personal fate, yet inwardly contained the full strategic vision of the Habsburgs. Maximilian did not see that marriage as a reward, nor as a bargain. He saw it as a door left slightly open, a door where, if one stepped through at the right moment, history could change direction without a single sword being drawn from its sheath. What matters is this: Maximilian did not act in haste. He considered the decision like a man trained to live with time. He knew a single right decision, placed in the right moment, could do what a lifetime of campaigning could not. And for that reason, when Maximilian stepped forward, he did not carry ambition displayed on the surface. He carried patience, the invisible. Priceless wealth the House of Habsburg had accumulated across generations. From that moment, the Habsburg marriage strategy was no longer an abstract principle. It became a concrete action. A door was opened, and behind that door was not only a new land, but a different Europe waiting to be connected. That gateway arrived in the form of a young woman, Mary of Burgundy. Mary was not merely a bride, she was the heiress of Burgundy, a rich, developed territory situated among Europe's most important commercial centers. Burgundy was what many rulers desired. Yet it was also difficult to hold by force, because it was surrounded by powers no less strong. The marriage between Maximilian and Mary was not written as a romantic story, nor prepared with illusions of personal happiness. It took shape in urgency, when both sides understood time was not on their side. For Maximilian, this was not choosing a partner, it was choosing a lifeline for his house. For Mary, it was not a royal dream, but a necessary shield to protect a threatened inheritance. Burgundy then was among the wealthiest and most complex regions in Europe. Its cities thrived with commerce, with trade routes linking the North Sea to the continental interior. That wealth made Burgundy the coveted target of stronger forces, ready to use violence to seize it. Mary stood at the center of that whirlpool, carrying the burden of a land seeking assurance. The Habsburgs, for their part, saw in Burgundy not only territory, but a doorway into a different world, a world where power was measured not only in land and soldiers, but in currency, merchant networks, and the flow of the economy. Entering that world through war would destroy the very thing they wished to possess. Entering through marriage, by contrast, allowed them to merge into that current without shattering it. When the wedding took place, no city was burned to mark victory. No army withdrew in defeat. Roads remained open. Markets still gathered. The daily lives of ordinary people continued as though nothing momentous had happened. Yet in history's deeper layer, a shift had begun. Relationships were rearranged. Inheritance rights were rewritten. And Europe's map, though not instantly recolored, had changed direction. From that moment onward, marriage for the Habsburgs was no longer a single tool used when necessary. It became a principle of action, a lens through which they viewed all of Europe. The continent was no longer merely a set of lands to be seized, but a complex network of ruling families, where each dynasty was a knot, and if those knots could be tied by blood, the entire network would move in a way both gentle and irreversible. From here, the Habsburgs learned to read Europe the way others read a family tree. They saw potential not in walls, but in names, not in immediate victory, but in inheritance. And in that vision, each wedding was no longer the end of a personal story, but the beginning of a new order, an order built by layered connections across time, more durable than any conquest. The generation after Maximilian continued this path. His son, Philip the Handsome, married Joanna of Castile, heiress of Castile and Aragon. Once again, no great conquest occurred, yet through a wedding, the Habsburgs set foot on the Iberian Peninsula and indirectly opened the road toward the New World. Here, what matters is not the chain of events, but the thinking behind them. The Habsburgs did not ask, "How can we seize this land?" they asked. "How can we become the family of this land?" That question changed everything. For when a land is inherited, it does not need to be ruled by fear. It can be administered through ritual, through succession law, through bindings that make resistance far more complicated than obedience. Marriage also allowed the Habsburgs to avoid a great trap of power, isolation. A house that expands by war often stands alone, surrounded by enemies waiting for a chance. A house that expands by marriage is surrounded by relatives, in-laws, and relationships that make direct confrontation difficult, morally and politically. But this road was not without its cost. When power passes through marriage, it carries complexity. Territories are no longer contiguous. Different traditions must coexist. Languages, laws, and expectations overlap. A family becomes the center of multiple worlds and must learn not to collapse any one of them. The Habsburgs accepted that complexity, for they believed complexity could be managed, while war could never be fully controlled. In Europe's halls, where marriage contracts were signed by candlelight, Habsburg power grew not with cheers, but with oaths spoken very slowly. Their name appeared in the genealogies of many dynasties. They became part of Europe's collective memory, not as invaders, but as kin. And when a house becomes kin to many royal lines, removing it from the board becomes nearly impossible. Yet it was also here that the seed of another problem was planted, a problem the Habsburgs did not yet face at this moment. When marriage became the primary instrument, when blood became the thread tying power together, choice gradually narrowed, family circles closed in, names repeated again and again. But that is the story of another chapter, where the biological price of power will become clearer. For now, what you need to remember is this: the Habsburgs rewrote how a house could expand without ceaseless war. They turned weddings into geopolitical events. They turned genealogy into a map. And they turned patience into a form of strength that few recognized until it was too late. If you are listening now in that half-awake, half-dreaming state, let the image drift through you gently. Quiet halls, whispered vows, and a house growing, not through thunder, but through attachment. In the history of Europe, few strategies were as silent and as effective as this, and few left a mark so long-lasting. The Habsburgs chose that road, and they would go very far along it. There are moments in history when power becomes so vast that even the one who holds it can no longer see the full shape of himself. If tonight you are listening as your breathing has grown steadier, try to imagine a very early morning in the 16th century. The sun has just risen over Europe, lighting up ancient cities, gray stone monasteries, and castles lying silent beside rivers. But at that very same moment, across the ocean, the sun is also shining on distant lands so unfamiliar that European names have not yet even been fully spoken there. In that world, there was a man for whom, when the sun set in one part of his realm, it was rising in another, not because he moved faster than light, but because his power stretched so far that the hours of the day were no longer synchronized. When monasteries in Europe closed their doors for the evening, ships bearing his banners were still docking on faraway shores where dawn had only just touched the water. That man was Charles V. Charles did not reach the summit through a single battle, nor did he appear as a savior rising out of chaos. His path was quieter and heavier. He inherited. But what he inherited was not a kingdom with clear borders. It was a layered world, assembled from many traditions, many laws, many historical memories, sometimes in contradiction with one another. From his father, Charles received the Habsburg inheritance, Austria and the lands of Central Europe, a space of principalities, prince-electors, and the intricate political conventions of the Holy Roman Empire. There, power could not issue commands in a single direction. It had to be negotiated, recognized through ritual and consent. Along with this came the right to stand for the imperial throne, a great honor, but also a reminder that such power always had to be reaffirmed. From his mother, Charles inherited Spain, Castile, and Aragon, kingdoms stepping into an age of expansion unlike anything before. With them came newly discovered lands in the New World, where gold, silver, goods, and unbelievable reports began flowing into Europe like an endless river. That treasure brought immense financial strength, but it also carried responsibilities far beyond the experience of traditional rule, governing oceanic distance, unfamiliar populations, and an unprecedented world. And then there was Burgundy, the third bloodline running through Charles's veins. From it, he held the wealthy territories of the Netherlands and the Low Countries, where commercial cities like Antwerp became the heartbeat of Europe's economy. Here, power did not rest simply on sword or lineage, but on money, credit, and the confidence of merchants. These lands demanded a wholly different style of rule, subtle, flexible, and constantly attentive to local interests. When all these inheritances came together in the hands of one man, they did not form a single unified mass, easy to control. They formed a layered map, where each territory had its own rhythm, expectations, and limits. Charles could not govern them all with one model. Every decision had to be translated into many languages, not only in speech, but in law, ritual, and concessions suited to each place. And so, Charles's empire did not resemble a tower rising straight into the sky. It resembled a network spread wide, where the weight of power was distributed everywhere, and that very vastness was both the source of strength and a silent burden in that moment of history. Charles V was not merely the ruler of many lands. He was a man forced to learn how to live with the simultaneity of the whole world, where the sun never set and responsibility never rested. While Charles was still very young, the map of his power had already stretched so far that no single lifetime could traverse it all. Later generations called it the empire on which the sun never sets. But to Charles himself, it was not a romantic image. It was a burden. Charles grew up in a world where language was not merely a tool of communication, but a way of thinking. From very early on, he had to learn how to shift between different voices: French in the Burgundian court, Spanish on the Iberian Peninsula, German in Central Europe. And with each language came a different understanding of power, duty, and order. For Charles, speaking many languages was not a decorative advantage. It was a condition of survival. Every land he ruled demanded a different voice, a different approach. An order accepted in one place could be seen as an insult in another. A concession reasonable in one tradition could be judged as weakness in another. And so, Charles did not merely learn to speak many tongues, he learned to think in many languages at the same time. In Spain, he was king, there. Power was more centralized, tied to the idea of monarchy and a unified Catholic faith. People expected a king to make clear decisions, defend the faith, and embody the stability of the realm. In Spain, Charles had to wear that role, more rigid, more symbolic, with less room for public negotiation. But when Charles stepped into Central Europe, his role changed entirely. Here, he was not a king in any absolute sense, but an elected emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. His power existed through the recognition of prince-electors, dukes, and powerful bishops. He could not command unilaterally. He had to persuade, negotiate, and sometimes accept defeat while still preserving the dignity of all sides. In Central Europe, power did not lie in being the loudest voice, but in keeping the system functioning. And in the Burgundian lands and the Low Countries, Charles faced yet another reality. There, he was the lawful heir, but not a man who could rule at will. Wealthy cities, merchant councils, and fiercely protected local privileges required him to listen more than command. Here, power was not measured by crown or ritual, but by the ability to maintain the confidence of those who controlled trade and finance. This made Charles's reign a continuous series of role changes. One man, forced to live under many titles. One decision, needing to be presented in many forms in order to be accepted in each place. There was no single fixed center of his power, only temporary points of balance, shifting with the land beneath his feet. And within that fragmentation, Charles's burden gradually emerged. He could not be everything at once, and the more he tried to keep these roles from contradicting one another, the more clearly he felt that his power was not a solid block, but a fragile equilibrium, held together by language, ritual, and patience more than by any army. Charles V did not merely rule many lands. He lived in many worlds at the same time, and that, precisely, was what made him great, and what silently wore down the strength of a man carrying too many different understandings of power on his shoulders. There was no single throne upon which he could sit and say, "I rule all." Instead, Charles ruled by moving. His life became an unending chain of journeys, as though his power could not remain still if it wished to keep existing. From Spain to Germany, he crossed long stone roads, cold mountain passes, cities where church bells rang in different rhythms. From Italy to the Netherlands, he moved through lands speaking different tongues, believing in different political habits, expecting very different things from their ruler. Each journey was not only movement through space, but a shift of role, changing the way he spoke, the way he promised, the way he listened. There were years when Charles spent most of his time on horseback or on the deck of a ship. The halls where he granted audiences today might not see him again for many months. He rarely stayed long enough for any place to become home. And that absence, though necessary, also left a vacuum, for in an empire this vast, the presence of the ruler was not merely ceremonial. It was the thread that kept relationships from drifting too far apart. In that constant movement, Charles's power was both immense and fragile. Immense because few in history held so many territories at once. Fragile because each of those territories demanded continual attention, repeated confirmation that the bond still held. If he stayed away too long, doubts would grow. local interests would begin to question, and small cracks, if not sealed in time, could widen very quickly. Because an empire stretched across continents needs more than strength. Strength can conquer, but it cannot sustain lasting cohesion. What such an empire needs above all is consent, the acceptance that a distant central power remains trustworthy. But that consent grew harder and harder to preserve in a world changing at an unprecedented speed. The century of Charles V was no longer purely medieval. It stood on the threshold of a new age. Great fissures began to appear in the old foundations, and they could no longer be concealed by ritual or tradition. The Reformation erupted, challenging the exclusive role of the Catholic Church, one of the spiritual pillars of imperial authority. Faith, once a force of unity, became a deep division. At the same time, national kingdoms began forming a distinct sense of identity and interest. People no longer saw themselves only as subjects of a universal order, but as members of a specific community, speaking the same language, sharing the same history, and desiring greater self-determination. In this context, imperial power, though still sacred in name, was no longer accepted as absolute. It had to be explained, negotiated, and sometimes openly challenged. Charles stood in the midst of all these movements, like a man trying to keep balance on a bridge that was beginning to shake. Each step he took was an attempt to pull scattered fragments closer together. But the more he traveled, the more he realized that the world he inherited no longer remained still, waiting to be governed in the old way. And in that turning of the age, power was no longer something that could be held forever. It became a condition that had to be maintained continuously, through presence, compromise, and a nearly infinite endurance of the human body. Charles stood at the center of all those upheavals. As Holy Roman Emperor, he regarded the defense of the Catholic faith as a responsibility he could not abandon, but as ruler of a diverse empire, he also understood that repression could not bring lasting stability. He was pulled between two roles, guardian of the old order and manager of a new world coming into being. Many later criticized Charles for not being decisive, but in his context, that hesitation was not weakness. It was the consequence of trying to keep an enormous structure from collapsing. Try to imagine it. Every decision Charles made in Germany could provoke a reaction in Spain. Every concession in Italy could anger the electors of Central Europe. His power was like a cloth stretched too tight, pull anywhere, and it risked tearing somewhere else. And while Charles struggled to keep that cloth intact, the world outside did not wait. Kingdoms like France grew stronger and more independent. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe, creating constant military pressure in the New World. New lands brought immense wealth, but also administrative responsibilities far beyond traditional experience. Charles was not a dreamer. He saw clearly the limits of a human being confronted with the scale of power he held. And perhaps for that reason, the most important decision of his life was not a battle or a treaty. It was the decision to relinquish. When Charles V abdicated, dividing his empire between his brother and his son. Many saw it as a sign of failure, but seen more deeply, it was an act of acknowledgement, One man could not rule a global empire in the way older dynasties had ruled smaller domains. Charles divided his world so it might have a chance to survive. From this point forward, the Habsburg Empire was no longer a single absolute unity. It became two great branches, Spain and Austria, each continuing its own path, carrying a shared inheritance while facing different challenges. That moment marked both the summit and the limit of the Habsburg marriage strategy. Those marriages had lifted them into a position no European house had ever reached. But when power became too vast, that very connectivity also created a strain that could not be maintained forever. If you are listening now in that hazy space between waking and sleep, let the image of Charles V settle very gently, a man wearing many crowns, yet carrying a deep fatigue within. He did not lose one decisive battle. He was defeated by the scale of his own success, an empire on which the sun never sets. This sounds like praise, but in truth, it is a reminder that when power exceeds what a human being can manage, it will begin to divide itself. And from that moment, Habsburg history moved into a different rhythm, where preservation, rather than expansion, became the greatest challenge. But that is the story of the next parts. For tonight, let this story pause here, at the moment when power reached the highest peak any European dynasty had ever touched. A peak that was brilliant, vast, and very lonely. And when the sun set in one place, it was still rising elsewhere. But for Charles V, perhaps for the first time in his life, he allowed himself not to keep watching it anymore. Some wars do not begin over land, but over belief, not because a border has shifted, but because of a far deeper question. Who has the right to speak on behalf of God? If you are still listening tonight, try to imagine Europe entering the 16th century with a peculiar sense of unease. On the surface, the old order still appears intact. Churches still stand at the center of cities. Rituals are still performed. Crowns are still placed upon the heads of rulers in the name of divine will. Yet beneath that surface, a fracture has appeared, quietly but irreversibly. The Reformation did not erupt across Europe as a sudden storm of armed conflict. It did not begin with marching armies, besieged fortresses, or cities burning through the night. It began far more quietly, through words, through texts, through questions that seemed, at first, to belong only to monks and scholars, yet spread faster than any army that had ever marched across the continent. Thin sheets of paper, printed and passed from hand to hand, moved through monasteries, universities, and roadside inns. They carried no commands. They carried doubt, and once doubt is planted, it requires no swords to grow. It needs only to be read, whispered, and reconsidered in silence. When Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Church, he was not merely debating theology or ritual. He had, whether intentionally or not, touched something far deeper, the bond between faith and political power in Europe at that time, particularly within the Habsburg world. Those two had never been separate. The Holy Roman Empire did not exist as a state in the modern sense. It existed as a sacred order, where power was legitimized not only by law, but by the belief that it had been granted by God. The emperor was not merely a ruler by strength or tradition. He was entrusted with the responsibility of protecting the shared faith of the entire empire. The crown was not placed only upon a head, it rested upon the soul of an entire order. Within this structure, the church was not simply a place of worship, it was the pillar that upheld the meaning of power itself. Religious rituals affirmed the legitimacy of kings. Canon law reinforced social hierarchy, and shared belief created a moral language accepted by both ruler and subject alike. Thus, when faith itself began to be questioned, it was no longer a personal or purely religious matter. It became a political earthquake. If the church was no longer the sole voice of truth, then the emperor, who saw himself as its protector, no longer stood on solid ground. If individuals could confront faith directly, without intermediaries, then power built upon mediation began to lose its absoluteness. As faith fractured, the sacred order fractured with it, not loudly, but profoundly. Lands once bound by a common belief began to look at one another differently. Princes, cities, and communities began to choose not only how to pray, but who had the right to command. The greatest danger was not the coexistence of multiple beliefs. It was the absence of a shared foundation strong enough to hold those differences within a single structure. And it was precisely here that Europe entered a period in which every question of faith carried with it a question of power. No one debated merely to understand God more clearly. They debated to determine who would stand at the center of a changing world. From that moment on, the Reformation ceased to be an academic dispute. It became a silent force, slowly eroding the foundations of the old order. And for the Habsburgs, a dynasty whose fate was bound to the idea of a sacred empire, this marked the beginning of a trial that no army could resolve quickly. For the Habsburgs, this was never simply a scholarly disagreement among theologians. It was not a matter of right and wrong doctrine, nor a harmless difference in worship. To them, the Reformation was an existential threat, because it struck at the deepest foundation upon which their power rested. If the emperor was no longer recognized as the sole defender of the true faith, then his crown lost its sacred meaning. And if the crown was no longer sacred, it no longer stood above local powers. The emperor's legitimacy, never based solely on armies or wealth, began to waver. In a feudal world where power depended on recognition, once that recognition was divided, the intricate web holding the empire together began to tremble. The Habsburgs understood this clearly, and so their initial response was not immediate repression, but negotiation. Charles V, standing at the center of this seismic shift, did not rush toward violence. He believed the old order could still be saved if all sides were willing to sit together. He convened assemblies. He allowed debate. He listened to competing arguments about faith, hoping disagreement could remain within the bounds of reason and ritual. For Charles, this was not hesitation, it was duty. An emperor ruling a diverse empire could not govern by decree alone. He needed a broad consensus so that different lands could still feel they belonged to a single order. These efforts at compromise reflected a deep conviction that spiritual unity might still be restored if people were willing to engage in dialogue. But the world had already moved too far to return. The Reformation was no longer a movement that could be controlled from the center. Faith had become a personal experience. People no longer accepted a single truth simply because it descended from above. When individuals began to feel, they stood in direct relationship with belief itself. Every attempt to impose a common framework became burdensome, often counterproductive. Charles gradually confronted a bitter truth. The old order could not be repaired, not because he lacked power, but because the nature of the world had changed. The tools that once worked in the medieval era, rituals, edicts, sacred authority, no longer carried sufficient weight in a society awakening to individual conscience. When Charles V withdrew from political life, the burden did not disappear. It was neither resolved nor erased. It was merely passed on. The next generations of Habsburgs stepped onto the historical stage in circumstances far more difficult. An empire where religion was no longer a bond, but a boundary. They no longer ruled a world kneeling in the same direction. They ruled a continent divided by belief. Each land carried a religious choice, and with it, a political one. The emperor's authority, once a unifying center, became a force pulled apart from multiple directions. From that point forward, the Habsburgs no longer faced the question of how to defend a shared faith. They faced a far more difficult one: how to rule when nothing was truly shared. And within that void, where faith became a border, where legitimacy was no longer self-evident, the path toward greater conflict began to emerge, slowly but inevitably. The 17th century opened in an atmosphere of tension. Temporary treaties were signed, fragile compromises were accepted, but beneath the surface, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire increasingly aligned themselves by confession. Some chose Catholicism, some chose Protestantism, others chose silence, waiting to see who would prevail. The Habsburgs, as emperors, could not remain neutral. They still viewed themselves as defenders of Catholicism, not only out of belief, but because centuries of history had bound that role to their very identity. Then, in 1618, a seemingly small event shattered decades of restraint. A confrontation, a symbolic act, a body thrown from a window in Prague. History calls it the defenestration of Prague. But to those who lived in that moment, it was not a curiosity. It was a sign that patience had run out. From there, Europe slid into a conflict that would last 30 years, not as a single war, but as overlapping wars, religion intertwined with politics, power intertwined with old resentments. Foreign powers intervened not for faith, but for advantage. The 30 Years' War did not resemble earlier European conflicts. It had no clear front lines. It moved like a disease, spreading from region to region, changing form, changing justification, but never truly stopping. For the Habsburgs, this was a war of defense and desperation. They fought not only for territory, but for the meaning of imperial authority itself. Yet the longer it dragged on, the clearer a bitter truth became. Power built upon shared faith could not survive in a world where faith itself was divided. Central Europe became a repeatedly scarred battlefield. Cities were destroyed not for strategic value, but because they lay in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ordinary people, those unconcerned with theological debate, paid the highest price. Harvests were ruined, populations collapsed, once prosperous regions fell silent. And amid this devastation, imperial power did not grow, it eroded. Each passing year of war, each temporary treaty signed and broken, further weakened the idea that the Holy Roman Empire could impose a common order. External kingdoms, France, Sweden, intervened not to defend belief, but to weaken the Habsburgs. A religious war became a struggle for balance of power. By the time exhaustion set in, Europe was no longer the same. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 did not merely end the 30 Years' War. It ended an ancient idea that Europe could exist under a single sacred emperor. From that moment, power was redefined. It no longer rested on the defense of shared faith, but on the sovereignty of individual states. Each kingdom gained the right to choose its own religious and political path. The Habsburg Emperor remained, but in a diminished role, no longer the unquestioned center of Europe. For the Habsburgs, the 30 Years' War left a deep scar. It did not erase them from history, but it forced them to change how they existed. From guardians of a universal order, they became a regional power, strong, but no longer global in meaning. If you are listening now with your eyes closed, let that feeling linger gently. A Europe exhausted after 30 years of blood and fractured belief. A Habsburg Dynasty still standing, but no longer standing where it once did. And a new world taking shape. One where power no longer speaks the language of God, but the language of agreement. The 30 Years' War ended not in triumphant victory, but in the acknowledgement of limits. And within that acknowledgement, European history shifted into a different rhythm, quieter, more pragmatic, and colder. But that rhythm belongs to what comes next. Tonight, let this story rest here, at the moment when faith, power, and war converged and then dissolved, leaving behind a continent that could no longer return to its old dream of absolute unity. There are cities that were not built to display power, but to keep power from collapsing. If you are listening tonight, when the room has gone quiet, try to imagine a city on the Danube, not as a dazzling destination on a tourist map, but as an anchor, a place where the roads from east and west meet, a place where different languages collide, and then learn how to coexist. That city is Vienna. After the long shocks of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, Europe emerged from violence not with a sense of victory, but with a deep exhaustion. Lands that had once been prosperous now carried the marks of ruin. Populations were thinner. The memory of war remained etched into everyday life. More importantly than all of that, faith in a shared order had been worn down. The old order, built on unified belief and sacred authority, had broken. But the new order had not yet formed. Europe hovered in an uncertain stillness, where every arrangement felt provisional. In that stillness, the Habsburgs faced a question of survival. How could they continue to exist in a world that no longer offered the old foundations to stand upon? They could not return to a model of unity through faith, nor were they strong enough, or did they still have reason, to impose authority through unending war. What they needed was a center, not to display strength, but to reorganize. A place that could hold the rhythm of a diverse empire, where differences were not erased, but set within a common operating frame. Vienna gradually took on that role. This city had not always been the heart of the Habsburgs. In earlier centuries, their power was dispersed, moving with crowns and territories. But it was precisely that dispersal, after so many upheavals, that made them recognize the value of a stable anchor. Over time, Vienna proved to be the most suitable place for a dynasty accustomed to living with diversity and compromise. Vienna does not stand at Europe's edge, where power is easily forgotten, nor does it sit at an absolute center, where decisions risk becoming detached from reality. It lies in between, a point of intersection. From here, one can hear the echo of Western Europe, law, diplomacy, commerce, and new ideas about the state. At the same time, Vienna is close enough to feel the pressure from Eastern Europe, military movement, cultural differences, and the constant threat from forces beyond. That position shaped Vienna's role. It did not encourage rigid imposition. It compelled rulers to listen, to weigh, to grow accustomed to reconciling interests that did not match. Vienna became a place of negotiation more than command, where power was expressed through the ability to hold balance rather than deliver shock. In Vienna's grand halls, decisions were no longer made with the assumption that they would be naturally accepted. They had to be explained, adjusted, placed within the context of a Europe that had learned to doubt every form of absolute authority. And through that process, Vienna formed its own style of rule, calm, procedural, sometimes slow, yet capable of lasting. Vienna did not promise a perfect order. It promised an order that could function in a world after fracture, and for the Habsburgs, after centuries of upheaval. That was enough for this city to become the capital of a new understanding of European power. In Vienna, power was not performed like a fist. It was staged like a ritual. The grand halls of the Habsburg court did not exist only to issue commands. They were designed as spaces of encounter. There, envoys from across Europe entered with different customs, different interests, and war memories that had not yet faded. Memoranda were spread across tables. Treaties were drafted in careful language, avoiding at all costs the words that might rekindle conflict. Differences, religious, political, legal, were not denied, but placed upon the table to be handled. In that setting, Vienna gradually shaped a distinctive style of power. Power was no longer understood as the ability to coerce, but as the capacity to regulate, not victory or defeat, but the ability to keep all sides inside the same room. After the costly lessons of religious war, Europe began to value a new ambition, stability through administration, where procedure, law, and diplomatic ritual replaced violence as the primary instrument of order. But do not mistake that softness for weakness. Vienna was also a fortress, both materially and spiritually, from the 16th century onward. The city stood on the front line of a sustained pressure from the east. This was not only military pressure, but the pressure of a civilizational boundary. Routes through the Balkans opened into continuous friction between Central Europe and another political military world, where war, diplomacy, and belief followed different logics. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire turned Vienna into a focal point of shared anxiety. Every report from the eastern border was read closely at court. Every rebuilding season brought with it reinforced walls, adjusted grain stores, and prepared defense scenarios. Here, administration and defense were inseparable. What was negotiated in the Grand Hall had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure outside the gates. For the Habsburgs, Vienna was not merely the place where the crown was set. It was a barrier, a point that, if held, gave the whole structure of Central Europe a chance to stand. If lost, risked sending the order sliding into chaos. And so the city learned to speak two languages at once, the language of diplomacy in ordinary days, and the language of defense when necessity demanded. That duality forged a durable paradox. Vienna invited negotiation, yet was always ready to endure. From that paradox, Vienna's role was carved into Europe's memory, not as a capital of display, but as a capital of resistance, not as a place that imposed order with the sword, but as a place that kept order through the ability to stand firm against differences within and relentless pressure from without. For decades, Vienna lived with the awareness that it could become the front line at any moment. The city was fortified, defense systems were improved, but more importantly, the consciousness of Vienna's role was etched into the European mind. If this place held, Central Europe held. The greatest test came at the end of the 17th century, when Vienna faced a tangible, immediate threat. The siege of 1683 was not merely a military event. It was a trial of the entire structure the Habsburgs had labored to build. The city was surrounded. Resources were cut off. Time became an enemy. In those days, Vienna did not fight only with walls. It fought with networks, alliances, pleas for aid, relationships built long before, when relief arrived. It was not only a victory of an army, it was the victory of an order that knew how to connect. After that moment of danger, Vienna's role shifted in a way both subtle and decisive. The city was no longer merely the Habsburg capital. It became the symbol of a defensive Europe, where internal differences could be set aside when facing pressure from the outside. From then on, Vienna carried two parallel identities, a center of administration and an outpost of civilization. What is striking is how Vienna expressed power after those upheavals. Not through widespread retaliation, not through endless conquest, but through organization. The Habsburgs invested in administration, law, and institutions capable of sustaining long-term stability. Vienna became a place where power was stored, in documents, in ritual, in the habits of governance. Here, music rose not only for entertainment, but to shape rhythm. Melodies drifted through grand halls, churches, and squares, creating a sense of continuous order, where time was measured not only in hours, but in repeated ceremony. Music helped people grow accustomed to coexistence, many voices, many rhythms, yet falling into a shared frame in a multi-ethnic empire. That rhythm became a language that needed no translation. Art, too. It did not exist merely to decorate walls or beautify the court. Art in Vienna carried a duty to express order, balanced compositions, tightly organized spaces, recurring images of power and responsibility. All of it sent a quiet message, no matter how different. There is a structure wide enough to contain it. Art became a way of presenting power without threats, reminding people that order existed not only on paper, but in daily perception. Ceremony, therefore, was not simply display, it was an exercise of collective memory. Each ritual was repeated to emphasize continuity, to reassure that after the deep fractures of religion and war, there was still a common frame to return to when delegations entered the same space. When symbols were arranged in familiar sequences, the message did not lie in declarations, but in the feeling of stability that ritual produced. In this way, Vienna did not attempt to erase the empire's diversity, a task both impossible and dangerous. Instead, the city learned how to regulate it. It did not demand that everyone become the same. It demanded that everyone have a place. Differences were acknowledged, yet placed within a shared operational rhythm, where law, ceremony, and habit reduced friction. Regulation does not mean flattening. It means holding just enough distance that differences do not collide directly. Policy, culture, and urban life all move toward that goal, allowing multiple identities to exist without breaking the larger frame. In the world after religious wars, this was a modest but practical ambition, not to achieve perfect harmony, but to achieve the capacity for long coexistence. And so Vienna became the symbol of another kind of order, an order maintained not by constant coercion, but by stable habit. When music sounded at the right hour, when ceremony unfolded in its proper rhythm, when art kept space arranged, people learned to accept that difference did not have to lead to rupture. And within that acceptance, power found a more durable form, the power of keeping things going. The lands of the Habsburgs spoke different languages, kept different customs, and even believed in different things. Vienna did not force all of them into sameness. It created a center where differences could be moderated through law and ritual in a post-Westphalia world where national sovereignty was elevated. Vienna represented another model, the model of an administered empire, rather than a homogenized one. That is why Vienna became the capital of an order, not an absolute order, but an order that could endure, an order that understood it could not return to the sacred unity of the Middle Ages, yet also refused to accept perpetual chaos. For the Habsburgs, centering Vienna was an adaptive choice. When they could no longer rely on shared religious legitimacy, they shifted toward administrative capacity. When they could no longer impose order through belief, they built order through procedure, and Vienna was where those procedures were refined, standardized, and sent outward. If you are listening in that half-awake, half-asleep state, let the image of Vienna drift gently through your mind. Stone streets, quiet halls, bridges over the Danube, where the water moves steadily, neither rushed nor stopping. This city did not promise paradise. It promised continuation. In a Europe too familiar with rupture, continuation is a great value. And it was in Vienna that the Habsburgs learned the defining lesson of the New Age. Power was no longer the act of standing above everything, but the act of keeping everything from falling apart, not through the glow of a crown, but through the endurance of institutions. But as history always reminds us, no order lasts forever. Vienna could keep Europe's rhythm for a long time, yet deeper changes continued to accumulate in society, in thought, in the very structure of a multi-ethnic empire. That is the story of the next part. For tonight, let Vienna remain in your mind as a city of balance, where power learned to speak more softly, so it could survive longer. There are prices that are not paid immediately. They do not appear in a battle lost. They do not surface in an unfavorable treaty. They accumulate slowly through decisions that seem reasonable, through choices considered safe. And when that price finally reveals itself, it does not destroy a city. It destroys a bloodline. If you are still listening tonight, return to the strategy that carried the Habsburgs to the summit: marriage. For centuries, it was their most effective instrument of power. Marriage connected territories. Marriage connected dynasties. Marriage kept them at the center of the European chessboard without the constant need for war. But that very strategy, pushed to its extreme, created a dangerous paradox. Because, in order to keep power within the family, the Habsburgs gradually narrowed the circle of choice. When their territories had become vast enough, when nearly every major dynasty in Europe had already become kin, the Habsburgs' room to choose began to shrink. In earlier times, each marriage had been a door opening onto new lands. But at a certain point, there were fewer doors left. A marriage now was judged not only by what it could bring, but by what it might cause to be lost. Because marriage, in the world of power, is not only addition, it can also be division. A suitable match did not merely need to produce clear political benefit, it also had to ensure that power would not be scattered through different branches. Every new alliance carried the risk of splitting inheritance, complicating succession, and creating disputes that could last for decades. When a dynasty already controlled too much territory, opening new branches could become more dangerous than preserving the existing structure. In that situation, the easiest, and in the short term, the safest, way to avoid fragmentation was to turn inward. Marrying within the family kept power where it already was. No complex negotiations, no need to adjust succession laws, no fear of new claims arriving from the outside. Everything stayed within a familiar circle, where relationships were already understood. At first, this choice did not shock anyone in the European aristocratic world. Close kin marriage was not rare, nor was it viewed with the negative lens we have today. It could be legitimized through church decrees, provided special permission was granted. It was justified by political reasoning, protecting stability, preventing succession wars, preserving order. And in the short term, the strategy truly worked. Territories were not divided among outside houses. Succession remained clear. Legal disputes, those that could stretch over decades, were prevented early. Order seemed reinforced, and the dynasty continued to operate on the momentum that had brought success in the past. It was precisely because of these benefits that the choice slowly became a habit. What had once been seen as a temporary solution became the default. Each new generation looked at its own genealogy and saw in it not only history, but assurance. Remaining within the family became synonymous with safety, with continuity, with power that would not be threatened. But what the Habsburgs, like many dynasties, could not see immediately was time. Short-term advantages concealed long-term consequences that were accumulating in silence. That political reasonableness began to form a closed loop, where options grew fewer, and the capacity to adapt was steadily worn down. When every marriage had to return to the same circle, the bloodline no longer expanded, It contracted, and in that contraction, power could be held for a while longer, but the price being paid had already begun to take shape, quietly, deeper than the halls of power could recognize at the time. The problem was this: the human body does not operate by the logic of politics. Across successive generations, branches of the Habsburgs, especially the Spanish branch, fell into an increasingly closed pattern of marriage. Their unions no longer opened outward as before. Cousins married cousins. Uncles and nieces became husband and wife. Blood ties overlapped so densely that, on paper, the family tree no longer spread like a tree. It curled in on itself like a spiral. What is striking is this: in each individual generation, the consequences of that closure did not reveal themselves immediately. Each marriage, taken alone, could still be justified. Each child born was still welcomed with the full ritual of royalty. The court still functioned. Power still passed from father to son in proper order. There was no single moment clear enough for contemporaries to stop and say, "Something here is wrong." But history does not move by single generations. It moves by accumulation. Over time, signs began to appear, faintly, difficult to name, not dramatic disasters, but small details seeping into the daily life of the monarchy. Children were born weaker, fell ill more easily, required more care. Long, unexplained illnesses became more common. Births grew more difficult. The number of heirs surviving into adulthood gradually declined. Lifespan, even protected by living conditions far better than the social average, did not reflect corresponding health. The final years were often covered by sickness, fatigue, and prolonged weakness. But because everything unfolded slowly, because there was no single catastrophe large enough to cause panic, these signs were easily dismissed as personal fate rather than the consequence of a pattern extending across generations. In the halls of power, people continued to speak of treaties, alliances, and the maintenance of European order. What happened in birthing chambers, sick rooms, and within the bodies of royal family members rarely entered political discussion. The human body was treated as something that would adapt to the needs of power, while in reality, it was silently reacting against them. The Habsburg genealogy, once a symbol of wide-open connection, gradually became a record of repetition. Names appeared again and again, relationships returned to themselves, and each repetition, though offering political reassurance, diminished by a small degree the biological resilience of the bloodline. The most dangerous part of this process was not mere physical decline, but the delay in recognition. When a dynasty is accustomed to seeing power through the lens of strategy and ritual, it is extraordinarily difficult to accept that the true limit lies in biology, something that cannot be negotiated, cannot be bound by treaty, and cannot be postponed indefinitely. And so, for decades, Habsburg decline flowed like an underground current. It did not topple the throne at once. It merely made each generation a little more fragile than the one before. And when the signs could no longer be ignored, the bloodline that had once connected all of Europe confronted a cold truth. There are limits that even the oldest power cannot cross. But because power was still there, because the crown was still placed upon the right head, those signs were overlooked. In the grand halls, people spoke of alliances, ceremonies, the order of Europe, Few dared to speak of what happened in the royal bedchamber, in the birthing room, in the long years of illness that followed princes and princesses, until history no longer permitted silence. The clearest image of that price was concentrated in a single person, Charles II of Spain. Charles II was not a tyrant, nor was he a ruler remembered for ruthless decisions or excessive ambition. On the contrary, he embodied a quiet tragedy, a tragedy created not by character, but by the blood he inherited, in a dynasty shaped by ceremony, power, and symbolism. Charles II became an unwanted reminder of human limitation. From birth, his condition troubled the court. Charles grew up with a frail body, frequent illness, and slow development compared to the expectations placed upon a man destined to wear the Spanish crown. Difficulty speaking, unsteady walking, and limited concentration were not merely personal challenges. They became problems for an entire dynasty. Each basic skill a king was expected to possess had to be reached through immense effort, and sometimes was never reached fully at all in the daily life of the court. That fragility was concealed by ritual. Audiences were carefully arranged. Important documents were prepared in advance. Major decisions were often made by councils surrounding the king. Charles was present, but seldom truly commanded the space of power that was his. He did not rule, he was guarded, as though the entire dynasty were trying to keep the shell of authority from cracking further. What deepened Charles II's tragedy was that he was not an exception, but the result of a process stretching across generations. Modern historians no longer doubt the cause. When they analyze his genealogy, they see a level of inbreeding so extreme it is rare even by the standards of Europe's aristocracy at the time. Family branches that were already close continued to fold over one another, ensuring that harmful genetic traits were not dispersed, but repeated and amplified. What had once been seen as a strategy of preserving power, keeping territories within the family, avoiding succession disputes, maintaining the purity of blood, now revealed its underside. That closure produced a chain of biological consequences that could not be reversed. No decree, no ritual, no prayer could repair what had accumulated through generations. The painful truth is that Charles II seemed, in some way, to sense his difference. He lived in a world where every gaze was fixed upon him, waiting for a strength he could not provide, while other kings are remembered for battles or reforms. Charles is remembered for an incapacity not chosen. He did not fail because he made the wrong decisions, but because his body and mind were never given the chance to become what kingship demanded. In Charles II, Habsburg history reached a profound paradox. The dynasty that believed power could be preserved through bloodline was ultimately limited by that very bloodline. The last king of the Spanish Habsburg branch was not overthrown, not assassinated, not defeated on the battlefield. He simply could not continue. And in that silence, in the frail body of one man, an entire strategy spanning centuries revealed its true price. What is striking is this: the Spanish court was not blind. They recognized the king's condition, but they had no other choice. The entire structure of power had been built around the idea that sovereignty had to remain within Habsburg blood. When that blood weakened, there was no backup mechanism. Charles II became the last king of the Spanish Habsburg branch, not because he was deposed, but because he could not continue. He had no heir. And that absence was not merely a family problem. It was a geopolitical void. When Charles II died, Europe mourned a man less than it feared what would come next. Who would inherit Spain? Who would control vast territories stretching from Europe to the New World? The death of a frail man triggered a chain reaction that led to the War of the Spanish Succession. Here, the Habsburg paradox became unmistakable. They avoided war for centuries through marriage. Yet, in the end, they left behind a major war because there was no marriage left to make. Inbreeding did not merely weaken bodies, it weakened the adaptability of an entire dynasty. When choices narrowed, when every decision revolved around preserving pure blood, power became rigid. It could no longer flex to face a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, other European powers, France, England, rising new states, were learning to base authority on institutions, on law, on state machinery, rather than on absolute bloodline. The Habsburgs, once masters of long strategy, began to fall behind because of their loyalty to an older one. This did not happen overnight. There was no single spectacular collapse. Habsburg decline unfolded like a chronic illness, slow, persistent, and impossible to cure with surface measures. They still held the throne in Austria. They still remained important in Central Europe. But the aura of being the family that ruled Europe began to fade. Power no longer spread through blood. It was constrained by it. If you are listening with your eyes closed, notice this feeling. A dynasty that once believed closure would protect it from chaos was ultimately weakened from within by that same closure. This is not a simple moral lesson. It is a cold rule. Any strategy, when it succeeds for too long, risks becoming a burden if it is not adjusted. The Habsburgs did what very few dynasties achieved. They built power through patience, connection, and time. But they also proved something less often spoken. No bloodline is strong enough to replace the ability to adapt. And when the world moved into the age of the modern state, of institutions and law, bloodline, once a pillar, gradually became a limit. The price of bloodline does not arrive with an explosion. It arrives as the long fatigue of a lineage that has gone too far down the path of closure. And from there, the Habsburg story moved toward its ending, not through sudden destruction, but through a slow retreat from the center of history. But to understand how a dynasty can decline and still endure long afterward, we must look to the final chapter, where legacy is measured not only by the power once held, but by the mark left on Europe. That is the story of the last part. For tonight, leave in silence this image, a bloodline that once connected an entire continent, finally curling back into itself and learning, too late, that no strategy is immune to time. Some dynasties decline because they refuse to change. But there are also dynasties that endure longer precisely because they dare to change, though that change is never completely gentle. If tonight you are listening as your breathing has slowed, try to picture the Habsburgs entering the 18th century with a feeling very different from their golden age. They were no longer the family that stitched all of Europe together through marriage. They no longer represented an absolute sacred order. The cracks left by war, by inbreeding, by religious division, those were still there. But the Habsburgs had not disappeared, and what kept them in history now was no longer bloodline, but reform. The one who opened that turning point was Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa was not a typical product of the Enlightenment, and that is precisely what makes her role distinctive. She was sincerely devout, believed in traditional order, and had no intention of tearing down the entire structures that had shaped the Habsburgs for centuries. In her way of thinking, the world still needed ritual, needed duty, needed a clear moral order for people to hold on to. She did not dream of a society wholly rebuilt by reason. Yet Maria Theresa understood something many of her contemporaries still avoided. The old order could only be protected if it knew how to adjust itself. If the empire's way of operating did not change, if the machinery continued to rely too heavily on privilege, inertia, and habit, then the Habsburgs would not fall because of revolution, but because they would no longer be able to function. For her, reform was not a betrayal of tradition. It was the only way tradition could survive. The circumstances of Maria Theresa's accession etched that realization deeply into her mind. Her right of succession was questioned from the very beginning. In a world where royal authority was tightly bound to men, a woman standing at the head of a vast empire was seen as a weakness. External powers did not hide their doubt. Alliances were tested. Territories were eyed. The title itself, though lawful, was no longer enough to make rivals hesitate. That doubt forced Maria Theresa to face a harsh reality. Power could not rest only on bloodline and ritual. A crown might grant legitimacy, but it did not automatically create effectiveness. To survive, the empire needed a machine that could collect taxes regularly, recruit soldiers consistently, issue laws clearly, and enforce them. In other words, power had to rest on administrative capacity, something measurable, improvable, sustainable, not merely inherited. So, Maria Theresa did not begin her reign with philosophical declarations. She began by strengthening the foundations. She looked into each part of the empire and asked a very practical question. Is it working? Does it serve long-term stability? Those questions, dry as they seemed, were revolutionary within a dynasty long accustomed to relying on symbol more than mechanism. Maria Theresa's caution was not the result of a lack of vision, but of her understanding of the price of rupture. She knew a multi-ethnic empire could not endure shock after shock, and so her reforms advanced step by step, tied to survival needs rather than abstract ideals. She kept what could be kept, changed what had to be changed, and within that balance, the Habsburgs began learning how to endure in a world that was shifting from this humble yet steady starting point. Maria Theresa laid the groundwork for a new phase, a phase in which Habsburg power would no longer be acknowledged only because of past glory, but because of present administrative ability. And that was the quiet yet decisive turn that enabled the empire to stand for a long time more amid Europe's waves of change. Maria Theresa's reforms did not begin with grand proclamations. They began with matters that seemed almost painfully dry: taxes, the army, administration, education. She understood that an empire could not function effectively if each territory taxed in its own way, trained its army by its own standard, and obeyed overlapping laws. And so, Maria Theresa began constructing a more modern, centralized state. Taxes were standardized, the administration was professionalized, officials were no longer chosen only by lineage, but by competence. The army was reorganized into a unified system, reducing dependence on local feudal forces. Those reforms were not glamorous, but they changed how power flowed through the empire, from personal relationships to institutions. In particular, Maria Theresa viewed education with a different eye than previous Habsburg generations. She saw education not only as a matter of morality or religion, but as the foundation of governance. Schools were expanded, mandatory primary education was encouraged. A generation of subjects who could read, write, and understand laws would be easier to govern than a society relying only on tradition and fear, while still defending the church's role. Maria Theresa began reducing religion's monopoly over spheres of daily life. It was a cautious move, but an important one. Power slowly shifted from absolute belief toward practical reason. When Maria Theresa died, one thing had become very clear, though it was never declared aloud. The Habsburgs were no longer merely a family living by ritual, bloodline, and the memory of the past. Through decades of careful restructuring, they had been transformed into a machine, a system capable of collecting taxes regularly, training an army to common standards, educating officials, recording, compiling statistics, and managing the lives of millions through procedures rather than dependence on individuals. That transformation was not loud. It did not take the shape of revolution, but it was deep. Habsburg power, once rooted in symbol and tradition, had begun to rest on structure, and in that very moment, when the empire had become stable enough that it no longer survived on inertia alone, history opened space for a very different kind of figure to appear. That was when Maria Theresa's son stepped onto the stage of history. That man was Joseph II. If Maria Theresa built foundations through patience, Joseph II wanted to push the door farther than safety allowed. He grew up in an empire already reorganized, in an age when Enlightenment ideas spread powerfully through books, letters, and Europe's courts. For Joseph II, the machinery his mother left behind was not only a tool of survival, it was a means to reshape society. Joseph II did not view power as an inheritance to be preserved intact. He saw it as a responsibility that must be rationalized in his thinking. If an institution existed, it had to serve a clear purpose. If a custom brought no concrete benefit to society, it should be revised or removed. Here, Enlightenment thought appeared not as pure philosophy, but as radical pragmatism. For that reason, Joseph II's vision was far bolder than his mother's. He did not want reform in order to preserve the old order. He wanted to redefine that order. This meant his reign was controversial from the start, what Maria Theresa carried out across decades. Joseph II wanted to accelerate within a single lifetime. This difference was not only one of temperament, but of historical timing. Maria Theresa reformed in a world still full of instability, where every change could trigger war. Joseph II reformed in an empire that had temporarily steadied, where the question was no longer, how do we survive, but how do we become rational? But here, the risk began to take shape. A machine that can operate efficiently does not mean it can absorb every change at once. Joseph II believed reason could replace tradition faster than reality allowed. He believed that a policy correct in principle would soon be accepted by society. And with that belief, he began testing the limits of the very machinery the Habsburgs had only just completed. If Maria Theresa reformed for survival, Joseph II reformed for conviction. He believed deeply in Enlightenment ideals, reason, equality before the law, and human welfare, not as abstract concepts, but as tools for building an effective state. Joseph II was not patient with the slowness of tradition. He did not want to patch the old order. He wanted to simplify it. One of his most shocking moves was a policy of religious toleration. Joseph II allowed other Christian denominations to exist legally within the empire, reducing the Catholic Church's controlling role in civil life. For a dynasty that had long seen itself as the defender of the faith, this was a historical reversal. He also carried out legal reforms, limited torture, improved the legal status of peasants, and gradually abolished serfdom in many regions. In Joseph II's thinking, subjects were not merely objects to be ruled, they were resources to be freed so the empire could grow stronger. But here, Joseph II's reforms revealed a major problem: speed. Joseph II reformed too quickly, too broadly, and with too little compromise. He believed reason was universal, that what was right in Vienna was right everywhere. But the Habsburg Empire was not a homogeneous society. It was a collection of many peoples, many traditions, many historical memories. Reforms imposed from the center, though progressive on paper, provoked resistance in reality. Local communities felt their customs were being violated. The nobility lost privileges, the church lost influence, and even those who were liberated were not always ready for change that came too fast. Joseph II gradually realized a painful truth. Reform cannot only be right, it must be accepted. Before his death, he was forced to withdraw part of his policies, not because they were entirely wrong, but because the empire was not yet able to absorb everything at once. It was not an absolute failure, but a lesson about the limits of reason when facing history and identity. Yet the legacy of Maria Theresa and Joseph II remained. They accomplished something many earlier dynasties did not realize was necessary. They shifted the Habsburgs from a family sustained by bloodline, ritual, and the memory of the past into a state run through administration and law. Power no longer lay primarily in overlapping family ties, in ceremonies that affirmed the sacredness of the blood, but increasingly in structures that could endure even as individuals changed. In this new order, stability no longer depended entirely on who married whom, who was born from which branch, or who possessed a purer right of inheritance. It depended on whether laws were enforced, whether taxes were collected regularly, whether education produced people who understood the law, and whether the administrative machine continued to function, no matter who sat at the top. This marked a profound shift in Habsburg history. for the first time. Their power was no longer entirely identical with the bodies of those who wore the crown. The state began to exist as a separate entity, larger than any one individual, more durable than any single reign. An emperor could be weak, yet the machine would still run. A dynasty could change its style, yet the law would keep its rhythm. More importantly, they proved that power could be maintained not by closing in the bloodline, but by expanding society's capacity, instead of trying to keep authority within a circle of lineage that grew ever smaller. They began drawing on broader resources, knowledge, education, administrative skill, and the conditional participation of subjects within a shared order. The Habsburgs, after all their decline, found another path to survival: adaptation. If you are listening in that half-awake, half-asleep state, let this image remain very gently. An aging empire, once fractured by the very strategy that created it, now rising not through force, but through reform, no longer dreaming of absolute unity, yet learning to operate within the modern world being born. Maria Theresa and Joseph II did not save the Habsburgs from every challenge, but they helped the dynasty cross a crucial threshold, from the feudal past into the era of the state. And precisely because of that shift, the Habsburgs continued to remain on Europe's map for many more decades, not as absolute rulers, but as part of an order in transition. This is the story of reform, imperfect, incomplete, yet enough to prove that history is not only a chain of decline, but also the persistent effort to adapt before time. If you are still listening at this hour, when the night has grown very deep, try to picture Europe in the early years of the 20th century. Electric light has replaced candles. Railways cut across lands that were once connected by marriage. Newspapers carry news faster than messengers ever could. And war, if it comes, will no longer be the affair of individual courts, but the affair of entire societies. In that world, the Habsburgs are still there, but they are no longer the center. A dynasty that once learned how to survive through ritual and then through reform now stands before a challenge that no marriage strategy and no administrative skill can fully dissolve: modern nationalism. This is no longer a courtly problem, no longer a puzzle of treaties. It is a change in the way people name themselves. Communities that once accepted life under a single crown begin to raise new questions: quiet, persistent, not who rules, but who are we? Not duty to the emperor, but attachment to language, memory, and the particular story of each community. In that context, Austria-Hungary appears as a fragile, multi-layered structure. On paper, the empire still functions, laws are issued, budgets are allocated, armies are mobilized, yet beneath the surface, the rhythms of life are no longer synchronized. Germans look toward their historic central role. Hungarians defend their privileges and distinct identity. Czechs, Croats, Poles, Italians carry different memories of justice, loss, and the futures they desire. They coexist within a shared legal and administrative system, but they no longer share a single story. The reforms of the 18th century made the machinery run more efficiently, taxation clearer, administration more professional, laws more uniform. But administrative efficiency does not automatically produce belonging. A state can operate smoothly and still lack a strong enough sense of we as the language of journalism, education, and literature begins to nourish national consciousness. These new identities become more compelling than any imperial symbol. People begin to demand representation not merely as obligation, but as identity. This fragility does not reveal itself in a single moment. It spreads slowly through parliamentary debates, through cultural movements, through the choice of which language is used in schools and courts. Each small concession made to preserve harmony only makes clearer that the center no longer has the strength to define a common whole. The empire, once strong because it could regulate diversity, now faces a paradox. What helped it endure for so long is no longer enough to keep it intact in the era of the nation-state. In that air, Habsburg power becomes both vast and hollow. They can still issue commands, but commands no longer reach the heart. They can still keep order, but that order increasingly resembles a postponement, when the question, who are we, becomes more important than who rules. Every structure built on administration alone exposes its limits. And so, before the empire dissolves on the map, it has already cracked in consciousness, not because it lacks law, but because it lacks a shared story strong enough to rise above memories and aspirations that are drifting apart. At the center of that order stands a figure who symbolizes both endurance and stagnation, Franz Joseph I. Franz Joseph I reigned for nearly 70 years, a span rare even in the histories of European dynasties. In that long rule, he witnessed almost the full rhythm of a continent's transformation, revolutions that shook thrones, waves of reform that challenged old privilege, industrialization reshaping city and countryside, and the rise of political consciousnesses that had never existed in the medieval world. Few monarchs lived long enough to watch the world around them change so much, and few carried the past so deeply with them as they stepped into the present. That very longevity turned Franz Joseph into a symbol of continuity. He did not attempt to recreate the empire through dramatic breakthroughs. He believed in duty, in order, in keeping everything moving according to familiar rhythm. In his mind, change too fast was dangerous. It was better to keep everything still long enough to prevent collapse. Stability, for Franz Joseph, was not perfection. It was endurance. For decades, that approach truly worked. The empire did not explode amid the shocks of the 19th century. Crises were softened by compromise. National tensions were channeled, postponed, or translated into administrative issues. The state apparatus, reformed since Maria Theresa and Joseph II, was strong enough to absorb pressure without breaking at once, in the eyes of many contemporaries. Franz Joseph embodied a kind of steadfast power, not dazzling, not progressive, but reliable. Yet postponement is not resolution. Problems do not vanish, they accumulate. Each compromise that eased tension in the short term made the long-term structure more complex. Each concession made to preserve order only clarified that the center was increasingly dependent on keeping everything not yet broken. Rather than creating a shared direction, the stability Franz Joseph pursued was like holding a lid tightly on a boiling pot, effective only until the pressure inside exceeds what the hands can bear. As the world entered the tense years of the early 20th century, the rhythm of history accelerated in a way that a dynasty built on patience could not keep up with. Industrialization made war total. Newspapers and mass politics amplified collective emotion. Nationalism shifted from cultural consciousness into clear political demands. In that context, contradictions compressed for decades began to seek release, not through slow administrative channels, but through sudden events. Franz Joseph held to his belief until the end of his life. That order, if maintained long enough, would balance itself. But history no longer waited. The distance between the tempo of an aging emperor and the tempo of the modern world grew wider and wider. And within that distance, an empire held together by delay began to face the final limit of the very strategy that had allowed it to endure so long. The fateful moment came not from Vienna, but from Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Habsburg heir, was not only a personal tragedy, it was a spark falling into a space already filled with flammable air. Military alliances were triggered. Ultimatums were sent, and very quickly, Europe slid into World War I. For the Habsburgs, this war differed from all previous wars in one fundamental way. It was no longer a conflict between dynasties competing for territory or honor. It was the war of emerging nation-states, of modern industry, of assembly lines producing weapons, of railways, of newspapers, and of total mobilization. War was no longer contained within generals and diplomats. It entered every family, every village, every factory. For a multi-ethnic empire like the Habsburgs, this created a dangerous paradox. The central machine demanded uniform sacrifice, but the sense of belonging was no longer uniform. Communities increasingly alienated from Vienna were now asked to fight for an order that no longer felt like their own. When the motive is no longer shared duty, each call for sacrifice becomes harder to persuade. The war dragged on far beyond all expectations. Fronts opened and closed, and opened again. Losses rose with the industrial tempo of violence. The economy weakened as resources were drawn into war, while civilian life was crushed by shortage and inflation. In that context, loyalty, already thin, began to crack openly. Communities saw their future less and less tied to the empire, and more tied to new nations being imagined into existence. What collapsed, therefore, did not fall in a single dramatic instant. As fronts failed, as supply lines fractured, as news traveled faster than any attempt at control, the first thing lost was not territory, but faith. Faith that the empire could continue as a coherent whole. Faith that today's sacrifices would lead to a shared order tomorrow. By 1918, as the war reached its end, the Habsburgs were not overthrown by a bloody revolution in the capital. There was no palace seized in a single night. There was no single violent moment that closed 6 centuries. Instead, they dissolved. One region, one community, one institution after another declared its own path. New states appeared on the map, not as the result of a single decree, but as the crystallization of aspirations that had accumulated for decades, and Austria-Hungary ceased to exist. That ending carried an unmistakably modern quality, not loud with symbolism, but decisive in reality. The empire vanished because no one was willing to maintain it any longer. When central structures are no longer sustained by recognition, they become hollow. Trains carried officials away from Vienna. Documents transferring authority were signed. And a family that had once stood at the center of European history stepped out of it, not in sudden defeat, but in the silence of a world that had already turned the page. This was the outcome of a model of power that had served history for a very long time, but could not survive the moment when the question of who we are became stronger than every question of who rules. There was no grand ceremony for that moment, no final battle heavy with symbolism. A dynasty that had ruled Europe for nearly 6 centuries left the stage of history in administrative quiet. Abdication papers, decrees of termination, trains departing the capital. What makes this ending remarkable is not tragedy, but inevitability. The Habsburgs did not fail because they were incompetent in the final hour. They failed because the model they represented, a multi-ethnic order grounded in monarchy and central administration, no longer fit a world of national identity, mass democracy, and total war. But it must also be said clearly, the Habsburgs did not disappear because they refused to change. On the contrary, they changed a great deal, perhaps more than most dynasties of their age. What they could not do was change faster than history itself. When this family left the stage, they left behind not only palaces, charters, or the music still echoing through Vienna. They left behind a deeply human lesson. Power can be built through strategy, maintained through reform, and still be limited in the end by the way people understand who they are. And if you are listening to this story tonight, when your eyes have grown heavy, perhaps what remains is not the image of a crown falling, but a quiet sensation that history sometimes does not end with an explosion, but with the silent departure of a family that once stood at the center of the world. The Habsburgs were there for 600 years. And then, very softly, they stepped aside. And as this story slowly reaches its final minutes, perhaps what remains with you is not the name of any particular emperor, not a map of an empire, not the crowns that were lost, but a very quiet feeling that for most of Europe's history, power has not always existed like thunder. Sometimes it exists like a long breath, slow, steady, and enduring. The House of Habsburg ruled for 6 centuries, not because they were always the strongest, but because they understood how to endure over time. They learned how to adapt, they learned how to compromise, and sometimes they learned how to let go. When their empire dissolved in 1918, the world did not collapse. It was simply that a very old order gently withdrew from the stage of history. The castles were still there. The cities still lit their lamps each night. Only one thing was no longer there: a family no longer standing at the center of Europe. If you are listening to these words now, as sleep has come very close, you don't need to hold on to any conclusion. History does not demand that you remember. It only asks to be listened to. And if you feel that slow, unhurried stories like this help you drift into sleep more easily, please tap like on the video and subscribe to the channel to travel with us on the journeys ahead, through dynasties, through civilizations, and through stories that passed long ago, yet still whisper in the night. Wishing you a peaceful sleep, and see you again in the next story.